when you actually go and ask an average American, do you feel like things are improving, they quite frankly say no.
I don't think Trump would agree that he's a beaten president.
Job approval for Biden is about 40%.
There are bad signs for Biden across the polling, wherever you look. If a general election were being held tomorrow, the Labour Party would win around 400 seats.
In 2020, they went off and voted for Nick Clegg because they were impressed by him on television.
Nigel Farage is still the most popular political leader in the UK.
We've seen a lot of commentary about the rise of the populist right and some of the continental countries.
The ratio of tax to GDP over the next 5 years is going to be somewhere around 37%.
Regardless of what the headline numbers are saying or the headline policies are, that's how do they feel about their situation when they walk into that ballot box?
Hello and welcome to Capital Horizons, the podcast where money meets politics. I'm Igor Yelnik and this is Sir Michael Fallon. We're joined today by Patrick English, Director of Political Analytics of YouGov, a market research and data analytics firm. Hello, Patrick. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
And we're going to speak about elections today. And unlike most people like myself who only have an opinion, you also have some data. So let's start with the US. What are your polls saying about the potential results of the US election?
So you start with what I don't have too much data on, which is a good one to go for, I guess. We have our fantastic colleagues out over in the US who work specifically on YouGov, work in the United States and on that election. I am a little bit across it, and I think as far as really our data can tell at the minute, it's a dead heat. It's a really, really close race between the two presumptive nominees, Biden and Trump. At this stage, if an election were being held right now, it could very much go either way. The swing state polling across the rest of the industry does tend to suggest that Trump is ahead in a lot of those key races that actually will decide the election, because of course, the national leads, the national vote shares, really a hugely useful predictor of who's going to win the election, particularly if they're quite close. It's all about those state polls in your Pennsylvanias, in your Wisconsins and Michigans. And at the moment, they look stronger for Trump than they do for Biden. But of course, we're still a little ways out from the actual contest itself. The American economy is doing very well. And I think the Democrats and Biden are banking on that really coming through and counting for a lot when November actually comes around.
Yeah, well, job approval for Biden is about 40%, which doesn't seem to be too high.
No, yeah, there are bad signs for Biden across the polling, really, wherever you look. It doesn't really look brilliant. I think one of the key things, and one of the things that is, causing Democrats some concern, is that even though the aggregate figures, the raw numbers coming out of the US in terms of its economy, in terms of economic performance, are very good, the individual level response data, so when you actually go and ask an average American, do you feel like you're doing better off now, or do you feel like things are improving, they quite frankly say no. So the translation between those economic figures going up in the aggregate and perhaps, not in the abstract, but at least sort of one step removed from actual voters, is not seemingly translating down to the average American. The average American does not feel like things are getting better. They don't feel like things are improving for them. They don't feel like that Biden is solving sort of a lot of the economic problems which they currently have. And that is a puzzle, a conundrum, really, that they have to solve if they're going to be successful in November.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. In the US, only 25% of the voters believe that the country is moving in the right direction. About 50% of people who support Democrats believe that the country is on the right course, and 38% are thinking that it's not.
Those are bad news for an incumbent, for bad figures for an incumbent seeking re-election, right? That's not something you really want to be having sort of underlying your push. The fact that lots of people don't think you're doing a good job, lots of people don't feel well or good about the arguments you're trying to make to them. There's a danger, I think, that the Democrats and Biden start talking past the average American voter. If they're telling them, oh no, the economy is doing really well, everything is good, don't worry about it. That's not too far away from almost telling the average American voter that they're wrong about their own economic situations or wrong about the economy. And that's certainly, if that message develops or if that feeling develops, and that'll be disastrous, I think, for the Democrats and for Biden. I think one advantage they do have is that, of course, they are facing a very, let's say, polarizing opponent in Donald Trump. They're not up against somebody who a lot of voters can sort of flock to immediately from the sort of the independent side or from the sort of soft Democrat side and say, yes, that's a chap I really want back. He's also, of course, beaten Trump in the most recent election, so that also counts in his favor. It's difficult for beaten presidents to come back and try win again. So there are things that count against the Republicans. There are things that count in favor of the Democrats, but there's certainly a lot that is holding back, I think, or a lot of obstacles in the way of Biden getting re-elected in November.
I agree with that. I don't think Trump, by the way, would agree that he's a beaten president. I think he will still continue to argue he won the last election. I was out there a month ago, and I completely concur. It's all anecdotal. I don't see the data or talk to as many people as you do. But it seemed to me a month ago that first the Democrats had slightly more to worry about than the Republicans. And that if it was moving at all, it was moving the the Republican way. And I did talk to some key Democrats in Michigan, which is one of the 7 swing states, and that was true there. And this cost of living thing underneath the economic statistics, I think is the main challenge that the Democrats have to solve at the moment. But apart from cost of living and clearly borders and immigration, are there other factors between now and November that are likely to come into play that aren't already on the table?
I think those two are the most important. Again, I'm not quite as across the US data than the UK data, but from what I understand, those two are the really key issues. There are other things which will come up around perhaps the issue of Ukraine, of course. So that was a very, very, very stark dividing line between Trump and Biden, the Republicans and the Democrats. But recently that's softened a little bit. As far as we understand, Trump has kind of turned around a little bit on that, but we'll see. That issue will come back. The amount of funding that's been given out is only going to really probably last until the end of the year. So the issue is going to come back. It might come back on the table in time for November, perhaps not. I think the other issues that come up in US politics, again, kind of punctuate the debate around gun control. If there's another episode of gun violence leading up to the election, that could bring that back onto the table in a big way. Racial inequality, racial issues are always there as well. So that could come back as well. We can't really know. But I think in terms of long-term structural issues and the things which I would expect that are on the table now that will continue to dominate most of the coverage and most of the discussions around the US election between now and November, it would be the economy and it would be the borders. And I think those are two very tricky subjects for the Democrats, two slightly easier subjects for the Republicans. And that's perhaps explaining why, even though those net figures look good, the Democrats find themselves, in, let's say, not a hugely favorable position ahead of Biden's re-election attempt.
We're going to move you on, obviously, to the United Kingdom that we want to talk about, but maybe Western Europe. But perhaps one final question, if I may, on the USA, and that's the position of the Fed. I mean, do you see Fed decision making between now and the election actually having any further effect?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that all this is going to boil down to, and it includes the Fed, and includes the Biden, includes what the Republicans say and what kind of arguments they're making. All it comes down to, I think, is how the US voter feels when they walk into the ballot box compared to how they did 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. Do they feel like their personal economic situation, their personal household finances, their job security are in a better place? And do they want to, let's say, stick with what they have rather than twist into something else because of that? So I think all of this really is going to boil down to how it's received by the voters, what trickles down to them, what doesn't, and how do they feel, regardless of what the headline numbers are saying or the headline policies are or the policy actions or inactions that are or aren't taken. It's how do they feel about their situation, about how the American economy, the American life, the American dream, I guess, is treating them at the moment in time when they walk into that ballot booth.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Perhaps we could move on now to across the pond. We've got a whole bunch of elections in Western Europe, including the European Parliament elections. And then we've got our own election. I mean, first, perhaps, is there any really common theme? We've seen a lot of commentary about the rise of the populist right and feature, some quite strong personalities emerging in some of the continental countries. Is there really a theme, or is it just a patchwork of lots of little elections which will eventually stick together for the European Parliament elections?
Yeah, I think it is more of a patchwork. I think the sort of rise of the far right commentary is an easy one to make. It's an easy pattern to draw. But I think I've done a lot of work recently in Spain over the last year, and that's certainly not something which is happening in Spain at the moment. If I think the sort of centre left or the centre under the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is in a very strong position and just had a very good result in the Catalonian Parliament election as well. So there we have a different situation. In Portugal, the sort of centre right has come through there quite strongly. In Germany, I think certainly the AfD are causing a lot of headaches and a lot of problems, particularly for other sort of parties that are trying to compete on the issue of immigration or migration. But the main winners of the collapse or the fall in support for the incumbent SPD party over there, Olaf Scholz's party, are the CSU, Angela Merkel's old party. So they're the ones that kind of lead the polls, both in European voting intention and in Bundestag intention. I think in France, we seem to be in the same situation we have been in France now for the past, 8, 10, 12 years, really, where we have Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen, although she has stepped down from leader of the party, but has decided she wants to compete in the presidential election still. We'll see how that works out. They're doing very well. They look to be quite far ahead in European election vote intention. All signs point to them repeating their feat of getting into any second round presidential race in the future, and in the legislative as well. Many constituencies they will feature in the final two as well, I'm sure. So definitely, you can look across and pull out different stories from different places. There's even some parts of the Green parties across Europe are doing quite well. In Italy, of course, the far right are leading the government there. In the Netherlands, we've just seen, I think, the Geert Wilders' party have managed to put together a coalition for government. So, again, the far right doing very well getting to power there. The Swedish Democrats campaigned very successfully on the issue of linking together crime and immigration to win the election up there. But as I say, there's other instances, such as in Spain, where you can point to and say, well, actually, that story isn't translating whatsoever. So a patchwork of different scenarios and a patchwork of different stories, I think, which will come together, I think, in the European Parliament election to give a boost to the far right. But certainly, I don't think it's going to be a huge, great wave. Let me put it that way.
Okay, so if we move on to the UK elections, I mean, it's pretty clear that Labour is going to win it. The question is, how many seats are they going to get? Is it going to be a landslide victory or just a thin majority in Parliament?
So right now, the latest YouGov model suggests that if a general election were being held tomorrow, or sort of in the very, very immediate future, the Labour Party would win anything around 400 seats. So that's a majority. We're talking about 150. That is far, far, far bigger than the Boris Johnson majority from 2019. We have to go back to the Blair years to find anything of a similar size. So we're talking something really seismic. Now, of course, the election isn't being held right now. It's not going to be held even in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Most likely it's going to be held as with the US election in November. So things can change. And I think the two important things I would say about where the lead is now, which would lead me to think that it's not going to be where it is in November. One is that when elections are called, we do tend to see a squeeze on what we might call third, fourth, fifth party support. So right now, for instance, we have the Green Party at 8% of vote intention. We have Reform UK at anything around sort of 15% in vote intention. It's highly likely that when the question of who governs is at the front of voters' minds, rather than in an ideal world, if you had all the candidates on the ballot paper, who would you vote for? When they have to think about who they want to be prime minister, what we tend to see is that the two main parties, the parties who are above all others most likely to provide a prime minister or have the candidates for prime minister, voters start moving toward them and deciding which of the two that they would prefer to vote for in that sense. So I think that will push the figures a little bit. And of course, we know there's far more of a Reform UK vote share to squeeze than there is a Green Party share or Applied share or an SNP share. Equally, at the moment, about 15, 16, 17% of people that we ask in our vote intention polls are telling us that they don't know who they're going to vote for in an election, or they don't know who they would vote for if an election were being held tomorrow. We think a lot of those people are voters. They're not people who are going to drop out of the electorate. They will back a party. And around 60% of them are 2019 Conservative voters. Now, let me put that into historical context. 16, 17% of voters at this stage or presumed stage in an election cycle telling us they don't know who they will vote for is pretty normal. That's not a huge number at all. What is very unusual is the partisan composition of that 16%. The fact that it is so heavily Conservative driven is unusual and does give us cause to think that when the, again, who governs question is on, when the election really is happening, when they really have to make a choice, and if they want to go out to the ballot box and vote, they're going to have to decide who to do that for, is much more likely that a lot of that bloc will go Conservative than they will Labour or to another party. So because of those two factors, I do think that lead will narrow when the election is called and as we get toward election day. It happened in 1997, so I think we can expect it to happen again. Will it narrow enough to deny Labour Party victory? I strongly doubt that. I haven't seen anything in the data that would suggest that it would take us to a hung parliament situation or even a Conservative largest party. They remain possibilities. Anything does in British politics. But at the minute, looking at the data, looking at all the signs, looking at the local election results, looking at the by-election results, there's nothing to suggest anything other than a pretty handy Labour victory is coming down the track.
Can you explain this unusual majority within the undecided category?
So we think it's because a lot of voters who voted for the Conservatives in 2019, they were first-time or second-time Conservative Party voters, and they had done so after really falling out of love with the Labour Party for the most part. So a lot of them feel quite politically homeless. They feel like they went to the Conservative Party over the issue of Brexit or because of Boris Johnson, or for other reasons sort of over the course of the last 2-3 election cycles, and they feel completely let down and completely underwhelmed with everything the Conservatives have been offering them and betrayed even in some circumstances. We saw a lot of it happen around Partygate as well, and that was a big issue. A lot of people got so angry with the Conservative Party, and that anger still lingers, and a lot of them are still in that camp of being unsure. However, they also really don't think that they're going to vote Labour. And as much as we push them and we talk to them quite a lot and we kind of assess their propensity to vote Labour, it doesn't look very high at all. So at the minute, essentially what they are voters, many of them who are first or maybe second-time Conservative voters, who really don't like the Conservatives, really don't like Rishi Sunak, really don't think the Conservatives are up to much, but equally really don't like the Labour Party. So they haven't really got anywhere to go. So they're sat there at the moment thinking, well, yeah, I do want to vote. I'm sure I probably will go out and vote, but I just can't look at any of them right now and say that that's what I want. So that's who they are, I think, or that's who the majority of them are.
I mean, that happened occasionally in elections. I mean, in 2020, they went off and voted for Nick Clegg because they were impressed by him on television, and he presented himself as a natural home. Just perhaps a word from you on those third, fourth parties. If you're determined to vote against your Conservative MP, is the data big enough to allow you to extrapolate as to whether the Liberal Democrats, where they're lying second, will in fact come through as first, or whether you're going to see a Labour revival in some of those Conservative Liberal seats?
So the data at the minute suggests exactly that the Liberal Democrats are very well poised to turn a lot of their second places into first places. We must remember that they got a huge amount of second places in the 2019 election. The headline number of seats that they won, as 12, I believe it was, really sort of belies the fact that they had very strong momentum, and a lot of those Conservative voting, but also Remain-leaning, increasingly commuter belt, young professional families, sort of hubs, if you like, around major cities in the south, or mostly around London, to be honest. The Liberal Democrats had a really good time there in 2019, and since then have been sweeping across council seats. Even this former Prime Minister David Cameron now has a sort of Liberal Democrat councillors. Theresa May has Liberal Democrat councillors. They're everywhere. They really are. And again, the MRP modelling that we do at YouGov, which is a big sort of powerful statistical model which can take vote intention data and project it down to constituencies, suggests that Liberal Democrats could win anything between 40 to 50 seats in the next election, and the vast majority of them are coming from areas where they came second in 2019, and they're beating Conservative incumbents. And they're going to do that, we think, by basically not increasing their vote share nationally whatsoever. It's just become more efficient, and because of the decline in the Conservative vote share, it's going to bring the Liberal Democrats through, really, without them having to do all that much in terms of putting on another million or so votes.
And does that have any effect at all on the Labour majority?
Well, it certainly makes their task of being the largest party much easier if the Liberal Democrats are doing very well, particularly in the South. So if we imagine a situation where Labour just falls short of that majority line, if the Conservatives are right up behind them, it makes their task of governing a lot harder. However, if the Liberal Democrats have taken 40 seats off them, the Conservatives will still be way back on 250 or something like that. So they're really not in a position to challenge Labour or bring down a legislation or sort of capitalize on any rebellions, because they're too many seats behind. It also gives Labour a much, let's say, a priori, a more comfortable coalition or confidence and supply partner than the SNP, that would be politically a very dangerous move for Labour, I think. And of course, he would look to extract a lot of things that a lot of Labour voters, and particularly those who might sort of being won over from the Conservatives, may not be so comfortable with. So I think it would very much help Labour out in two ways in that regard.
And turning then to Scotland, I noticed that a number of those seats have relatively small majorities, and some of them are sort of four-way seats where all four parties have got quite chunky votes. I mean, where do you see Labour at the moment in Scotland? Do you see them moving right up to 30 seats and beyond, or are they still perhaps in the low 20s?
Yeah, Scotland is an absolute nightmare to model because it's you don't get a huge amount of Scottish respondents in data, and as you say so correctly, there are so many marginal seats in Scotland, and there always have been. It's by far the most marginal area of the United Kingdom, has the highest concentration of marginal seats. It's very, very difficult. Often seats there are decided by 100 votes, 200 votes, 300 votes, and as you say, there can be three parties involved, sometimes even four. It's quite remarkable, and the pattern of party support is always different across the constituencies. It's tricky. That said, at the minute, the data does seem to suggest that Labour will become the largest party in Scotland again for the first time since 2010. Now, that is significant. That's really important. What we're projecting at the moment is the SNP are falling back. And because of all the factors we just outlined, the SNP don't actually have to fall back all that much for them to lose a lot of seats. They currently hold a lot of seats with very small majorities. So if they're down even 4 or 5%, they start dropping to the low 30s. We think that Labour currently are around about the 30-seat mark in Scotland, but all of that can change, and a lot can happen in between now and November. But certainly at the moment, if an election were happening now, we probably would expect, we believe that Labour would be the largest party, and then they are sort of on the sort of 30, 32 mark.
If we think about Reform UK, they have gained popularity recently quite a lot. Do you think that it can translate into parliament seats?
Yeah, that's a question that is plaguing my mind right now. We certainly, at YouGov, I think we have one of the highest Reform UK shares, and at the minute, it's just not translating down to the ballot box. We're just not seeing a party that is at sort of 16% or whatever it is in the polls, going out there and winning council seats or winning or pushing really hard in by-elections, which is, of course, what UKIP did in the sort of the 2013 to 2016 era. They put on some really impressive performances. They were winning, 100 councillors in local authority elections. Reform UK in the most recent ones just won 2. So if you look at the evidence in the ballot boxes so far, you'd struggle to make an argument that Reform UK are going to win a seat. And indeed, in our MRP modelling, what we notice about the Reform UK vote shares, it seems to be very, very flat across the country. It's very inefficient. It's about 12% according to the MRP model, and the range of that at the seat level is somewhere between sort of 5 and 25. That's not going to win you any seats whatsoever. If the Reform UK are going to really compete in some constituencies or really going to start returning some MPs, we need to be seeing them on 30, 35, 40% in some constituencies, and we're just not seeing that. And I think that has. There's 2 or 3 hypotheses about why that is, and I'll just touch on 2 of them briefly. One is that the party machinery around Reform UK is quite simply non-existent. They're not even set up as a political party, right? They're set up as some kind of company with they can sort of direct things from above. So there isn't really a party machine there. They don't really have a get out to vote operation. They're not really sure where their voters are. They also don't really stand candidates in a way that we might think is strategic or logical. Where they stood in Sunderland in the last local elections, they'd actually did very, very well, very impressive indeed when they stood across Sunderland. In other areas, very sort of high leave voting areas with a lot of angry Conservative voters who aren't going to go to Labour, they just didn't stand. They didn't put any candidates forward, but they did try pretty hard in London. So it's difficult to really pick up a sense that Reform UK are organising correctly and organising in a way that a political party that is going to break through is going to do so. If you look at the work that the Green Party, for example, put on in order just to get one MP and to try and sort of win councils and council seats, it's an astronomical amount of work. And the Liberal Democrats, of course, put all that effort in before, and they'll tell you how difficult it is to break through in a majoritarian first past the post system as a party that's not the Labour or the Conservative. So I think that's holding Reform UK back. Another hypothesis is that the voters who are currently telling pollsters that they will go out and vote Reform UK right now are more a mixture of protest Conservative voters. So when push comes to shove, they will actually vote Conservative, but right now they're very angry about that and they're telling us they're going to vote Reform UK. And or they're not the sort of voters who go out and vote in local elections or second order elections, including by-elections. And that explains why we don't see Reform UK reach the kind of numbers or have the kind of impact that UKIP did when they were knocking about. So, the third hypothesis as well, I'm not thinking about, which is the pulse is just wrong and we should all go away. But I think hopefully the explanation is in one of the former two.
Okay, it's interesting that Reform UK is sort of stealing popularity but not votes. Why is their popularity gaining at the expense of the Conservative Party?
Yes, so the Reform UK support is overwhelmingly drawn from former Conservative voters in our polls. If you look at the sort of cost breaks of it, it's overwhelmingly Conservative voters who are going to back the party. A lot of the reason why is because of the issue of immigration. Tied in with the general malaise of the Conservative Party, a deep unpopularity for Rishi Sunak and the cabinet and the government that's currently in place, but mostly anger around the issue of immigration, the fact that they think that the Conservative Party has completely failed on the issue and failed to provide any solutions. So naturally, a natural home for a voter who has been voting for the Conservatives but doesn't like their offer on immigration is Reform UK. Further to the right, offering a more hardline position, a very unapologetic, tough stance on the issue, which appeals very, very, very much to a lot of those voters. Now, it's a different thing to be attracted to a party, particularly over a single issue, than it is to actually go out and vote for them when push comes to shove, or indeed to go out and vote at all. So it could be the case that right now it's one thing to tick a box in a poll when you're faced with it on your phone or on your computer, but when you're actually at the ballot box, a lot of these people are finding they don't even have a Reform UK candidate to vote for. So they might end up going back to the Conservatives or simply not turning out at all. That is probably, I think that's the key difference really between stealing support or stealing popularity and stealing votes, is that, it's one thing involves pollsters putting them on a list. The other involves an actual electoral operation that is able to service votes and is able to convince voters that actually we're not just here for immigration. We're not just here for whatever. This is a serious party that's doing serious stuff and you need to come out and vote for us.
Don't you think that apart from the immigration issue, it's also about the tax policies of the Conservative government? The ratio of tax to GDP over the next 5 years is going to be somewhere around 37%, which is huge. In this regard, the Conservative government looks more like a Labour government.
I mean, yes, certainly there's a lot to be said around the current tax rate and the fact that the Conservatives have kind of put us up there, and Rishi Sunak sort of talks a lot about being a tax-cutting prime minister, but sort of fiscal drag might sort of challenge him on that. But regardless of the politics of it, I think tax as an issue is not something that's high on the minds of voters. Immigration, however, is. So not many voters are really paying all that much attention to what the tax rate is or voting in terms of tax, but they will vote in terms of immigration. Now, that said, they will also, and they are, in terms of vote intention right now, prioritizing economic issues much higher than immigration. And of course, part of economic issues is the amount of money that they have in their pockets to pay their bills coming through their doors, which is negotiated or at least tempered by tax. So I think parties making offers on tax, which equate to you will have more money in your pocket to pay bills going through your doors, is a way to, I think, maybe talk about tax or get tax into the vote winning equation. But in and of itself, taxation, I don't think is a vote changer or a vote driver. It's more about the story you can tell or the connections you can make between tax, the economy, household bills, household finances, and the cost of living.
Patrick, it's often said that international policy or international issues feature pretty rarely in British elections. I mean, Brexit was obviously an exception. What about the context this year? If the situation in Ukraine deteriorates, if we get slightly more dragged into the conflict, if there's the prospect of a very uncertain return by Trump to the presidency, is it possible that one party or the other might benefit from a tougher, clearer position, either on defence or on the relationship with the United States?
Certainly, I think it's the case that international issues are far more prominent and far more part of the average voter's mind than they have been for quite some time. Although, as you say, Brexit being an exception to that. We have, of course, the conflict in Ukraine and sort of the Ukraine-Russia war. I don't think there's really much for parties to do there. The public consensus on that issue is extremely clear, and neither party really is seriously, I don't think, deviating from each other on their position regarding Ukraine. So there's probably not a more maximalist position you can take in terms of public opinion other than give Ukraine what they want because this is a terrible situation, which is where the public are on that issue right now. Of course, that contrasts greatly with the situation in the US, but at the minute, that's not what we have in the terms of the cause of public opinion in the United Kingdom. The other major sort of conflict, though, however, Israel-Gaza, is something which is much trickier and has much more sort of nuance in public opinion and has much more, let's say, sticky ground or provides many more sticky wickets for both parties, really, to deal with, not least because of the way it ties into domestic issues around race, racism, around the sort of the politics surrounding ethnic minority enfranchisement and representation, and issues which matter to different voter tribes in the UK. It's something which Labour, of course, naturally are much more exposed to, and we've seen it evidenced in the local election results. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that in areas with a much higher Muslim population, Labour really struggled in the context of a local election where they were generally improving and generally performing very well. So certainly that conflict has the potential to really, really sort of put some dividing lines down and cause a lot of issues, particularly for the Labour Party as it moves toward the general election. You can imagine a situation where they suddenly find they can't take seats like Peterborough because they've had 5-6% of their 2019 coalition drop out from the baseline, and the voters that they won over from the Conservatives aren't enough to make up for that gap. So there are situations where this could really matter for Labour. I'm not sure right now we're projecting that that's going to be the case, but you don't know come down the line in November this year. In terms of the US, go on.
I'm trying to phrase my question a little better, actually. Is there much evidence that if people feel more insecure generally about the international situation, whether it's Gaza or the Red Sea or Putin, does that pull them slightly further to the government in place? Is there any evidence of that? It's often said, cling to nurse in case things get, even worse. Does that stack up in the polling?
Yes, it does. A good example is when COVID was really first striking, we saw what we call a rally around the flag effect for democratic governments really across Europe and indeed America. What that means is in a situation of crisis, when people feel very insecure or there's something dramatic happening within the country or sort of worldwide, voters or the public will tend to rally around the government of the day and sort of push them forward and wish them well and give them their support as the controllers of the levers of power, the ones who can exercise the decision-making capacities to deal with the situation to hopefully the benefit of the country. So we saw Boris Johnson's government get more popular and his approval ratings go up during the sort of initial phases of COVID. And this was true for pretty much all states he looked across, particularly with relatively new incumbent governments. We saw this effect. So certainly, if the world gets more insecure, we might see an effect where people look toward the government and say, well, you guys are looking after this situation. Maybe we should lend you a bit of support, a bit of goodwill to try and deal with it. And indeed, the Conservatives, defence is one of those areas where the Conservatives still leads Labour on public opinion. There really aren't many at all, not even the economy, but defence is one of them. So if defence, if defence becomes more prominent and becomes something that is rather than a third, perhaps, order concern for voters that is now, to rising right to the top, that can be very electorally beneficial for the Conservatives, who are still, even now, in the sort of the doldrums of their support, I guess, nationally, seen as a better option on that issue than Labour are.
Do you think the bank can do anything to help the Conservatives?
I think it depends on what happens in the world between now and November. I think for the moment, as with taxation, defence is not something which is hugely prominent in the mind of the average voter. The average voter doesn't think very much about politics. The average voter doesn't really like politics that much. The average voter likes politics when it's not on the front page of the newspaper. So they don't really they're not picking apart things as much, certainly nowhere near as much as we do in our day-to-day life. So I think it could be a benefit to the Conservatives if it really does come up the issue agenda, if it is supplanting things like the cost of living, if it's supplanting things like immigration, or if the government are able to turn immigration into a security issue or some kind of defence issue. That could be another route through to it. But the government has very, 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 very little credit on the issue of immigration. So I think that would be a big ask.
I think I saw on your website that Nigel Farage is still the most popular political leader in the UK. Do you think that it's possible that the Conservatives are going to change their leader prior to the elections? And if not, do you think that it's possible they will do it after the elections?
Very briefly on the Farage one, that particular data isn't drawn from our politically balanced panels, so you should definitely take that one with a little bit of pinch of salt. I think if you put him through the political bolsters, I guess, of our political samples that we run as part of the political team, he is not the most popular politician, but he's certainly up there, and he's certainly streets and streets ahead of Rishi Sunak. To answer the actual question you asked, leaders certainly matter. They matter in a huge way, and particularly they matter for a huge way for the Labour and the Conservative parties, because, as I sort of said at the top of some of my answers, a lot of voters, when they go to the ballot box for a general election, the one question in their mind is who governs? Who do they want to be Prime Minister? Which of the two party leaders do they want to see lead their country for the next 3, 4, 5 years? So if your candidate for that position is weak, is poor, as Jeremy Corbyn was in 2019, and Boris Johnson wasn't spectacularly popular at all, but he was much more popular relatively than Corbyn was, and he had much more credit among the electorate as a Prime Minister than Corbyn did. And that was a major part of the story as to why Labour lost so badly in 2019. So unless you're presenting the public with a strong option for Prime Minister, the leader of the country, you're really not going to do very well. Now, in terms of whether or not the Conservatives will replace their leader, I don't think so. I don't have any particularly strong connections or sort of insights into the inner thinkings of the Conservative Party right now, but the signs are that that's not going to happen. We were promised some kind of resurrection of the rebellion post-local elections, but that didn't happen even after Andy Street was eventually confirmed to have been defeated, which was apparently one of the litmus tests of whether or not they're going to go for it. So I don't think they're going to at this point. I think Sunak is probably safe until the election. Will they replace him afterwards? I think almost certainly, particularly if the projections that we currently have for an election hold true. If I think there's no scenario really in which Sunak can stay on, unless he has really, really driven Labour close to the wall in terms of being the largest party in Parliament. He may be able to make some argument, but taking the Conservatives from 365 seats down to 265, I don't think would be a particularly strong position for him to look to remain in power afterwards.
if I may take you back to the tax issue, Jeremy Hunt is bringing it up as a big thing, but I was quite surprised that he's speaking quite a lot about the reduction of the national insurance contribution. The national insurance contribution is not even a tax on the individual, it's a tax on the company. Don't you think that something more drastic, like, for example, the abolition of the inheritance tax, could increase the popularity of the Tory government?
Yeah, so I think there's an important distinction to make, which you have kind of made implicitly in your question there, to say like tax as an issue isn't something that voters think about, versus if you do stuff on tax, voters will notice and care about it. That is certainly true, and it's certainly possible for a government or a party to make strong offers on tax and for that to be a vote winner. That's absolutely the case. The trick would be to tie it into issues that they do care about, such as right now, for example, the economy and the cost of living. I think that's very much a fair route for them to take. Regarding what the government or any party should or shouldn't do in terms of making offers, what I would say is that national insurance strikes me as a very bizarre tax to be going after in any sense, because it's not a really unpopular tax. No taxes are popular, but national insurance is by far not an unpopular, by far one of the least unpopular taxes going. The reason why, and of course it's not really true when you boil it down to how the numbers work, is they associate that with things like pensions, healthcare, sort of social good. And then generally speaking, they don't see it as an unfair tax, and they don't see it as something that they're particularly egregious to paying. And indeed, that would extend to the employer side of it as well. It's all kind of seen packaged as part of this social good, contribution to not just wider society's functioning, but your own functioning and your own health and protection when you retire. So it's not seen as a tax that people really sort of care too much about. Income tax, on the other hand, people are much less favourable toward income tax. And as you mentioned, inheritance tax. People really don't like inheritance tax whatsoever. I think personally making offers on inheritance tax is tricky, particularly for the Conservatives, because electorally and politically it plays very badly for them into Labour lines around looking after themselves, looking after the millionaires, prioritising the rich. So I think that's a tricky offer to make, even though it perhaps may not in and of itself be unpopular with the public. But certainly looking at some other taxes, such as income tax or indeed wholesale tax reform, could very much be popular and could very much be vote winners for either party if they manage to successfully connect it to sort of as an explanation or a way or a provision to deal with the issues that voters are telling us and telling politicians and telling political parties that they care about and they want things done on.
Yeah, but the inheritance tax, on the other hand, is a very small tax. It only brings 6 to 7 billion pounds a year to the coffers, and it's within the rounding error. Who cares?
Well, quite. It wouldn't make a difference in that regard, but I think politically it would just be very, very tricky for the Conservatives to do that. You can imagine a scenario. Let's say Rishi Sunak announces next week that he's going to abolish inheritance tax. And the initial reaction from public opinion probably would be fairly fine, because, as I said, the public don't view inheritance tax as very fair. However, in the weeks and months to come, what they will do is they will paint that, they will take that as an example, or they'll push it to the public as an example of the Conservatives simply looking after the rich, the Conservatives looking after people who pay inheritance tax, the Conservatives looking after people who have lots of money. And they will go to the average voter and say, well, how are you feeling right now? Do you feel like you have lots of money? Do you feel like you're economically secure? Well, the Conservatives are not interested. They had a chance to look after you, to do some things, to try and improve your cost of living situation. And instead, they chose to cut taxes for the rich. So I think it's just politically toxic right now, particularly in this economic environment and in this cost of living environment, for the Conservatives to do anything on inheritance tax, regardless of the fact of whether it changes any rounding errors or has some kind of baseline support with the public.
But it's the same about the marginal rate of the income tax.
Potentially, although you can point straight toward people's pockets and their paychecks and say, look, there it is. There's your tax saving. There's the amount of remember, you see the difference between this month and last month? That's because this government did this for you. And it's a much clearer line, I think, and there's a much stronger evidence. And it's something that, income tax, everybody pays, even pensions pay it. So it's something you can really point to, I think, across the spectrum, across society, and say, this is the government delivering for you on the cost of living. I'm not saying, that's what they should do, but I think it's a much clearer and cleaner route.
Okay, could you perhaps just fill in some of the other things that are still fairly uncertain? I mean, in terms of turnout does seem to have varied in recent elections. Do you have any kind of prediction to make on that? If, on the one hand, the race is seen as a pretty foregone conclusion, but a slight mystery as to how large the majority is going to be, is that in itself going to affect turnout? Is turnout on a longer term, although there have been blips in some elections, is it on a longer term downward trend?
Yes, so it is over recent election cycles declining, generally speaking. Turnout is declining across developed democracies. Political engagement, particularly among younger sections of society, is decreasing and declining, and therefore the aggregate statistics it is dropping. So given that, we probably would expect, if we're going to bet in any direction, for turnout to be down on the last election in 2019. So as you alluded to, when voters view that races are not competitive, that also tends to suppress turnout. They also don't tend to turn out as much when they don't view there's much competition between the parties. So if the parties are very aligned on a lot of issues, that can depress turnout as well. And I think that's something that Labour or rather should be slightly cautious of when they are tying themselves to conservative rules around the economy or around fiscal options, is that if they negate the space between the two parties, add on the fact that many voters think that they're going to win anyway, we might suddenly face ourselves with a very low turnout election, and a very low turnout election would be much more likely to hurt Labour than it would the Conservatives.
And have you made any prediction in terms of turnout for this election? Is
that
possible to do?
No, predicting turnout is something I think we would always shy away from, because being an online panel, the people who sign up to our panels are more politically engaged on average. They're more likely to be voters. In any survey you take, people tend to overestimate their own turnout historically and their propensity to turn out. So probably not something we would be projecting, no.
Okay, Patrick, thank you very much. This has been very interesting, and we hope your projections will come true, but not all of them.
Yes.
Thank you. It was great to have you on the show.
Yep, my absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Would you agree with Patrick's view on, especially on the UK election?
Yes, I think that was a fairly sober and straightforward view of factors that are already there in place in terms of perception of the parties. Overall, if you put the evidence together, that is pointing towards a fairly substantial Labour majority.
Because the needle seems to have moved in the last half a year from the thin majority to the landslide majority.
I'm not sure about that. I think that, the Labour poll lead has been pretty static, actually. Since Sunak became Prime Minister, it's hovered around 17, 18, 19, 20%. It hasn't really changed. But it's not going to tighten as much as would be needed, really, to get Labour below, say, a 50, 60 seat majority.
Thanks for listening. This has been Capital Horizons.
So if you would like to see or learn more about Capital Horizons, please subscribe below.
From Michael and I, see you next time.